Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, in this week's episode, we are going to return to the issue and the topic of biblical prophecy and current events. Listen, friends, I know most of you are absolutely emotionally burnt out after this incredibly emotional, painful election year with the American election, at least most Americans watching this. And so I think it's time to sort of put all of that behind us, if you will, and simply turn to some profound events that have been unfolding right in front of us, which have largely been, well, not completely overlooked, but much of which have been overlooked because so much attention has been focused on the election. Now, this happens every 4 years. An election year, 90% of the news just revolves around what's going on with the American presidential election. And so oftentimes a lot of very important events tend to sort of float under the radar. And I know folks have been paying attention. But listen, what has been unfolding since this summer, 2016, right up until right now, as I'm recording this, tomorrow is the election. So as I'm sitting here with you, I actually have no idea who won, although I pretty much think I know who will win regardless. There has been some profound events that have been unfolding in the nation of Turkey. Since the failed coup, right up until today, the events that have been unfolding in the nation of Turkey, the aftermath after the so-called coup, the failed coup, have been absolutely profound. They have been profound clearly from the perspective of biblical prophecy, because as I have said multiple times over the years, the biblical prophets clearly have a significant emphasis on the area of Asia Minor, the modern-day Republic of Turkey. I think Turkey has a profound place within biblical prophecy. But even beyond that, even if we're just looking at this from a geopolitical perspective, if you're just, if you don't even believe in the Bible, if you have no interest in biblical prophecy whatsoever, you're just analyzing world events from a geopolitical perspective, from a military perspective, whatever it may be, what is unfolding in Turkey right now is historical, it's profound, and it's going to have dramatic ramifications for the years ahead. So the title of this week's episode is Turkey and the Coming Caliphate, and this will probably be the first in a series of episodes where we'll discuss this, because there's just so much here. There's just so much here, so much that's unfolding, so much that we can look at. And so my guess is we'll barely just begin to get through it. But in order to do that, what I want to do, of course, is just back up and deal with the history, look at a map. Let's just deal with the history of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. How have we gotten to where we are today, and why is it relevant? So first of all, again, Westerners in general, but clearly most infamous for being illiterate with regard to the world, with regard to maps, are Americans. So let's just take some time and just stare at a map for a few minutes here. This is a map of the Ottoman Empire at the time of its greatest extent. And so, most of us are aware, of course, of where Turkey is, this whole sort of big thumb that juts out, this big bridge that sits in between Europe and the Middle East, Asia, really at the center of three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. But, in its heyday, at the time of its greatest extent, the Ottoman Empire was massive. I mean, we're talking, it controlled this whole area extending all the way down the whole southwest coast of modern-day Saudi Arabia. They controlled Islam's two holiest cities of Mecca and Medina, Yathrib, which would also extending over into Egypt and all the way across North Africa, called the Maghreb, and then extending all the way well up into Europe and into the areas today that are Romania, Moldova, Ukraine, all the way to Russia, all the way around the Black Sea, and then from there extending all the way over to the Persian Gulf, to the modern day nations of Iran and Kuwait and so forth. So this was a massive, massive empire. And I think a lot of times we don't often realize what a tremendous empire it was. And of course, it was founded in 1299, so a year before the beginning of the 14th century, right up until 1923. So here we are, an empire, a massive Mediterranean empire that existed for well over 600 years. This is historically speaking, this is a profoundly relevant empire. Now, in 1923, what you had was a fellow came along named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And Ataturk, of course, was a brilliant he was a genius. And to summarize it, long story short, Ataturk looked at the success, the rise of Europe. He looked at the Industrial Revolution, all of their advances and so forth, and he basically looked at Turkey and he said, the Islamic world is increasingly becoming a backwater, whereas the Western Christian world is rising and prospering. And he said, what can we do? What can he do to make Turkey a competitor, to make Turkey on equal terms with Europe? And he believed that Islam was the problem. He believed that Islam was an impediment to advancement, et cetera, et cetera. And so he set up an ingenious system of checks and balances, whereby if Islamists ever tried to take over the government, as opposed to secularists, which he was. Now, he was fine, by the way, with Turks having this Islamic identity. He just wanted to keep Islam out of government, out of the government system. So he set up this system of checks and balances, where it's a parliamentary system and so forth. But ultimately, if the government became too Islamist, the military would engage in a coup and kick them out. And that's actually happened several times throughout the history of the Turkish Republic over the past 80 plus years. There's been a handful of times where the military has stepped in and kicked out the Islamists. Now, there's another character that we need to be aware of, and his name is Bediüzzaman Said al-Nursi. Bediüzzaman Said al-Nursi. And so Nursi was contending with Ataturk. He was contending with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the father of, we now call it Kemalism. Again, the system of government that controls Turkey and has for over the past 80 plus years. Al-Nursi was an Islamist. Al-Nursi was an Islamist thinker. He was a theologian. He was a Muslim. And he, of course, wanted to establish Islamic law. He wanted the Turks to live under Sharia. They believe that's God's law. They wanted the Islamic government. He wanted to return to the caliphate. But he knew that with Kemalism on the rise, he was now a suspect. And so he looked at this and he said, how can Islam function, not only function parallel to Kemalism, but thrive under it, grow, prosper, and eventually take over? And so al-Nursi essentially fashioned a kind of Islam that was very different than the Islam that most of us know. It was a very modern form of Islam, a kind of Islam that uses the language of science, that talks frequently of science and how the Quran and scientific advancements go hand in hand. He talked about peace and tolerance and all of the things that the West loves and takes pride in. He talked about things like interfaith dialogue, the dialogue of civilizations. He talked about service, acts of service, issues of justice. These are all things that a largely secular-leaning or even Judeo-Christian culture embraces and welcomes. So essentially, his method, his approach, was to create a kind of Islam that rather than resisting and fighting against the West through jihad, through a militant form of Islam, he said, no, I'm going to create a kind of Islam that they will simply welcome. They'll roll the red carpet out for it. They'll say, isn't this wonderful? They'll actually promote this kind of Islam, and it will allow us to infiltrate the system. Okay, so this was Nursi's approach, and he was profoundly successful. And so this, I'll call it, Nursiism. This is really the foundation for modern day Turkish Islam. And Turkish Islam, we need to understand, is quite different than Salafi, Wahhabi, Saudi Arabian Islam. Again, it has this veneer, this appearance of social justice and service and interfaith dialogue and all of these things. Well, of course, Nursi was very successful, but then after him came another man named Fethullah Gulen. Gulen was a disciple of Nursi, and he really carried the torch. He took it the next step further, and he developed schools all over the world, which was a big part of his method to spread his message. And he developed millions of disciples throughout Turkey and really all over the world. And so he was the very natural successor to Nursi. Now, here's the thing. If you were to read any number of reviews of Fethullah Gulen over the past 15, 20 years, I mean, put out by writers in prestigious universities all across the world, Harvard, Georgetown, he was treated and looked to as if he was like this Muslim Gandhi. I mean, he is spoken of on a level almost equal to Jesus, with just sublime superlatives. He's just the most wonderful, tolerant. His intellect is on a level beyond. He's the kind of religious leader that we're all looking for. And again, they just drool all over his talk of tolerance. And he's known as the weeping imam because he cries often. He's got so much passion when he preaches. Well, listen, Gulen actually has been living in rural Pennsylvania for the past, since I want to say the early 90s. And he's considered to be the wealthiest Islamist in the whole world, worth billions of dollars. We won't get into all of that in terms of where he got his money and so forth. But here's an individual who has, again, carried the torch of Turkish Islam. He's been profoundly successful. He's got dozens of schools all across the United States, these charter schools. And they all have these incredibly innocuous names like, the Rainbow Academy, or just names that you would never suspect as being owned and run by a Turkish Islamist. So he's this very interesting, intriguing, shadowy figure. But again, he's been living in rural Pennsylvania since the 90s. Many argue that he has been supported and funded and protected by the American government, but the reason that he's in Pennsylvania is because he had to flee. He had to flee the Turkish government because they knew who he really was. They knew that he was an Islamist whose real goal was to infiltrate Turkish government and to take over from within. People go, well, that's a conspiracy theory. We have a video, this grainy old video of Gulen actually addressing his supporters. And he's not using all the language of tolerance and moderation, but here's what he says. And this is a very telling quote. He says this. Now listen to this. And again, this is on tape. He said, "You must move into the arteries of the system without anyone noticing your existence until you reach all the power centers. You must wait until such a time as you have gotten all the state power, until you have brought to your side all the constitutional institutions in Turkey." So here he is, just clear, flat out making a statement. You have to be sneaky. You have to be secretive. You have to infiltrate the system. And then eventually you'll take over from there. Now listen, he was wildly successful. The Gulenists over the past 20, 30 years have indeed infiltrated the arteries of the Turkish government. Every aspect and facet of Turkish society has been infiltrated by these Gulenists, by these supporters of Fethullah Gulen. Their ultimate goal is what? They want to return to the caliphate. They want to return to the Ottoman Empire. They, in the same way that the Salafis, the Saudi Arabian Wahhabis, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, in the same way they want to establish an Islamic government, the Gulenists want to do the same thing. However, they often do have a much more service-oriented, moderate, peaceful sort of approach to it, but their goals are the same. We need to recognize that. For this week's episode, we are offering The Antichrist, Turkey, and the Coming Caliphate DVD. This 5-session teaching DVD features my newest teaching covering all of the latest events unfolding in the nation of Turkey, the history and theology which explains why Turkey is so critical within biblical prophecy, and what to watch for next. This newest teaching DVD is only $25. Or, for a bundle discount, you can get a signed copy of my book, Mideast Beast, The Scriptural Case for an Islamic Antichrist, along with The Antichrist, Turkey, and the Coming Caliphate DVD, as well as the Antichrist Debate DVD, featuring a historical debate between Dr. Thomas Ice of the Pre-Tribulational Research Institute and myself, nearly 3 hours long. That's the Mideast Beast book, the Antichrist, Turkey, and the Coming Caliphate DVD, and the debate between Dr. Tommy Ice and myself for only $50. To order any of these special offers, go to joelstrumpet.com and click on the store. When you order any of these products, you help support this ministry. Why is Turkey so important right now? Why am I focusing on it? Because I am convinced that right now we have in our midst, we have right in front of us, we have the rise of what is essentially a neo-Nazi Islamist nation. We have a nation which in many ways has many parallels to Nazi Germany. And you go, whoa, hold on. Because listen, I understand that referring to people as Nazis or comparing someone to Hitler, this is the single most overused analogy. It's abused. I mean, in the internet, the joke is every fight ends up with someone calling someone Hitler or a Nazi. It always gets there and comparing someone to. I understand that. We want to be very careful when it comes to Nazi analogies. However, in some cases, the analogy, the comparison, the parallels are legitimate and they need to be taken very seriously. So I want to just highlight just a handful of the ways in which current Turkey parallels and mirrors Nazi Germany. So let's just hit on a few of these issues. First of all, both Turkey, current day Turkey right now, and Nazi Germany have a vibrant, runaway, out of control nationalism. Now, again, most Americans can't, we can relate, many Americans can relate to being patriotic, to saying, many Americans make America great again, having American pride, to having deep respect and reverence for the American flag, for the history of who we are as a people, et cetera, et cetera. Patriotic Americans can't even begin to comprehend the level of nationalism that exists in Turkey. It's 1,000 times more exaggerated and passionate than even the most passionate Donald Trump rally. And, he's had some pretty profound rallies this past year. The nationalism in Turkey is through the roof. Nationalism, of course, is this pride, this national pride, this idea that we as a people are superior, are better even. And nationalism isn't always superiority, but oftentimes it is better than other nations. That there's even oftentimes this idea that there's a divine endorsement, that God himself has chosen us to be the superior people, the superior race, that we're called to lead the world, all of these kind of things. That's exactly what exists in Turkey right now. Again, the Turks, they're very well aware of their history. They're aware of having ruled the whole Mediterranean, the Middle East for over 600 years, of having taken Islam, the leadership of the Islamic world by the helm, and that they're the ones steering the whole ship and so forth. They view the current situation of the Turkish Republic, the Republic of Turkey, as being a very temporary situation, but that their divine destiny and their calling is to return to the Ottoman Empire, to lead the Islamic world, yea, to lead the whole world. What else? Well, of course, anti-Semitism, hatred of the Jewish people, and then, of course, in modern times, anti-Zionism, a hatred of the state of Israel. Now, needless to say, Nazi Germany was profoundly anti-Semitic. It was anti-Semitism on a level that we've rarely seen in human history. Well, right now, the anti-Semitism in Turkey is through the roof. The conspiracy theories, all of the weirdest, worst Islamist conspiracy theories that are very common throughout much of the Islamic world are just thriving in Turkey. When you go to Turkey, you go to Istanbul, you go to some of the bookshops, you look at the covers of some of these books with all of the just horrific caricatures of these evil Jewish Orthodox Zionists that are trying to take over the world with their octopus tentacles, and all that kind of just gross stuff. It's very common and popular in Turkey right now. In fact, it's experiencing a revival. Even Mein Kampf, the book, has actually been a bestseller in Turkey over the past decade. So again, you have the nationalism that they both share. You have the anti-Semitism that they both share. What else? They both have a profound expansionist sentiment. They both believe that is their duty, their divine calling, their destiny, their fate, if you will, to expand, their right to expand their current borders. And so, needless to say, Adolf Hitler was trying to expand throughout all of Europe, and he believed that thing was just going to keep going. He was going to establish the Third Reich, which was going to last for 1,000 years because Germans, the Aryan race, were called to rule the world, etc., etc. Right now in Turkey, the Turks, many of them believe that it is their divine destiny to return to the Ottoman Empire, that out of the chaos of the current civil war in Syria and the mess in Iraq and so on and so forth, and America largely vacating the Middle East, that the Turks are going to turn back to the Middle East, once again lead the Islamic world, return to their prior glory days and so on and so forth, even to the point, listen, where the current president, Erdogan, has actually appealed to and used rhetoric. He's used maps, and these maps have appeared in major Turkish publications that have their borders far greater than the current Turkish Republic. The Turkish map that they're referring to was the borders that they were hoping to get back with the Lausanne Treaty, back when the Ottoman Empire was dissolving, but they didn't get them all. And he's saying, why should we abide by that? That was the greatest injustice. I mean, here we are dealing with something that happened over 80 years ago, and Erdogan saying that was unjust. And so he's referring to and using a map which actually includes large sections of modern-day Syria and Iraq, all of northern Iraq, Kurdistan, extending over and including Armenia, including a big section of Greece and Bulgaria, extending up into Europe, including Greek Cyprus. Okay, so this is, again, the expansionism. They're not even trying to, they're expansionist aspirations. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. Not even trying to hide it anymore. They're just openly saying, hey, we have a right to this. It's about our borders. It's about our, and he uses all the language to try to justify it. Well, it's the same thing that Hitler did. And it's interesting, by the way, that one of the political philosophers that was looked to and used to support the whole Nazi doctrine of expansion was this German political theorist named Karl Hochschaffer. And he coined a term called Lebensraum. Lebensraum translates as living space. And so Karl Hochschaffer and then, these various Nazi political philosophers took his stuff the next step. And he said, the Aryans, the German people, we need living space. We need to expand because it's assumed that what we are doing is good for everyone. You need us, sort of thing. That's why we're invading you. We're invading you to save you. And this is how dictatorships always frame their expansion. It's for the good of the people. Dictatorships are established for the good of the common folk, the Volks. And so Nazi Germany was profoundly nationalist, anti-Semitic, expansionist. Well, likewise, what are we seeing in Turkey today? We're seeing this call to return to the former Ottoman Empire. Well, interestingly, with regard to Karl Hochschaffer, is Ahmet Davutoglu, who was the former prime minister. He was actually canned. Why? Why was he canned? Because he was not completely submissive to Erdogan, the current president, the current dictator. He was not a complete party player. And so even though he was the architect that rose to the top with Erdogan, that was sort of the architect that led him to the top side by side, when he got to the top, Erdogan did what? He turned on him. You look at the stories, the history of various dictators, and history is littered with these type of examples where the dictator gets to the top and turns and executes his best friend that was by his side the whole time. Well, Davutoglu was a college professor. He wrote this book. It was a sort of magnum opus, his great work called Strategic Depth. And throughout the book, as he's detailing his plan for Turkish ascendancy, he repeatedly refers to the writings of Karl Hochschaffer, and he repeatedly, unabashedly, unashamedly uses the term Lebensraum. He uses the very same term that the Nazi political philosophers were using to justify their expansionism. And here's Davutoglu, the architect of the current Islamist government in power, and he's using the language of Nazi political philosophers unashamedly. Again, the parallels between current-day Turkey and Nazi Germany are profound. What else? Well, of course, Nazi Germany and current-day Turkey both share the commonality of being led by a dictator, by an undisputed, even savior-like dictator with an ego far beyond your average human being. I mean, quite frankly, megalomaniacs. When you look at the language, the reverence, the way that the people looked to Hitler, it was like a cult. In Turkey today, it's as if it's a cult. The AKP party, often there's been numerous newspaper articles over the past couple years where you have these leaders within political parties, mayors of major cities and so forth, referring to President Erdogan with terms that are very savior-like, that are only applied in the Quran to Allah and this sort of thing. And so you have, again, Germany had a dictator, Turkey had a dictator. Now, how has this all come about in Turkey? Well, as I said, the Gulenists infiltrated Turkey. And then, of course, all of a sudden, overnight, you have this failed Turkish coup in the summer of 2016. Well, essentially what this was a turf war, if you will, a gang war between, two drug cartels, so to speak. They work side by side, and all of a sudden one turns on the other. Why? Because during the protest of 2013, and while the secularists were protesting the government, Gulen in Pennsylvania criticized Erdogan. Suddenly Erdogan says, no one criticizes me. Even though Erdogan rode Gulen's people in the government, they had infiltrated the whole Turkish government, even though he rode them to power, even though he rode the Gulenists to power, once Gulen criticized him, he turned on them. And so the parallel here, and this is what's unfolded since the failed coup, which allegedly was the Gulenists realized that Erdogan's going after them. They tried rising up and taking over and removing Gulen and the current AKP party, supposedly. There's a lot of evidence that the whole thing was just staged, which wouldn't surprise me in the least bit. But since then, Erdogan has been using this as an excuse to purge the entire nation of anyone of any form of political dissent, whether military, whether governmental, opposition parties, very legitimate opposition parties, whether it's the journalists, whether it's university heads or professors, just common day people, those in the police, judiciary, the judges, you name it. Over 100,000 people since this summer in Turkey have been locked up, dismissed, fired, or just disappeared all across Turkey. This is profound. Now, what is the parallel? Well, of course, when Hitler rose to power, you had this episode that's referred to historically, infamously, as the Night of Long Knives. The Night of Long Knives. And this is when Hitler turned on the German SA, the Nazi SA, known as the Brown Shirts, and he had, over a period of a few nights, actually, it's called the Night of Long Knives. It was actually a few nights. He had them assassinated. Why? Because he was consolidating his absolute dictatorial powers. That's exactly what Erdogan is doing right now. He is consolidating his absolute dictatorship over the nation. What else? Well, of course, Hitler, because of a state of emergency in the name of the greater German good, etc., he suspended the law. It's just that simple. He suspended the law. What has Erdogan done? In the name of an emergency, a state of emergency, he's played on the emotions of the people. He has temporarily set aside, but it's now indefinitely, the Constitution. Now, he'll probably bring it back to try to make himself look like he has an air of legitimacy once he has got rid of all possible dissent in the nation. But he has suspended the law. Think of this. The government has suspended the law. If you're in Turkey, they can do whatever they want to you. There is no law. The government is the law. Erdogan is the law. The parallels between Erdogan and Hitler are profound. What else? Well, of course, Hitler turned on the Christians. He turned on the Christians. He turned on Bonhoeffer. He turned on Niemöller. He turned on Barth. All of these theologians and these leaders that were not submitting to the German Christian church, which was basically a cult. It wasn't even genuine. This was Nazism infiltrating the church. He turned on them. That's exactly what's happening in Turkey right now. Listen, friends, we're running out of time, but I just want to say this. Even if you don't believe in biblical prophecy, even if you're just looking at this, again, from the perspective of military, just geopolitical analysis, whatever, what's unfolding right now in Turkey is historical, it's profound, we need to be paying attention. But as believers, as those who believe that it's important for us to be aware, to discern what's unfolding in the earth, who believe that the words of the biblical prophets do indeed point to this part of the world as having profound relevance in the last days, in this period right before the end of this corrupt, wicked system and the return of Jesus and the establishment of his righteous kingdom on earth, we know that these events have profound relevance with regard to biblical prophecy. We need to be paying attention. If we are not just biblical prophecy, aficionados or connoisseurs, this is what we're interested in. Even beyond that, if we're missiologists, we understand that understanding these things, discerning these things, understanding what's coming next has profound relevance with regard to strategizing to reach the Islamic world and that part of the world with the gospel. We understand that Turkey is important. It's a major bridge nation. It's a major gateway nation. And what's unfolding right now in Turkey is profound. So listen, we're out of time, but I'm going to have to end it right here. We will return. We will discuss these things in some more detail. But for now, I just want to say that, as always, I appreciate you being with us. I look forward to seeing you all next week. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.